Massive thank you as always to patrons Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns and Justin Harper. And this week's random call out goes to patron Seamus O'Connell. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head, or follow us on social media and help spread the word. Today, substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero talks to Carl Erik Fisher, addiction psychiatrist and author of The Urge, Our History of Addiction. Carl draws on his own experience as a clinician, researcher and alcoholic in recovery to trace the history of the phenomenon that's troubled us for centuries. His book shows us how addiction has come to be deeply misunderstood and stigmatized in our times, despite being profoundly ordinary across recorded history, and how an honest reckoning with our past successes and failures with addiction can light a better way forward.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
What's the difference between addiction and a problem?
Yeah, it becomes very necessary to closely interrogate what we mean by addiction when we start making those types of distinctions. And there's so much cultural and social baggage attached to the term addiction that, as you saw in the book, it needs a lot of investigation to unravel. If anything, the book is a process of undoing. I wanted to at least get clear on, and in many cases, try to see through and counteract some of the misleading connotations that get attached to words like addiction. So before I go too far afield on some big tangent, I'll just say, in response to your question about what's an addiction and what's a problem, there's one view that there isn't a meaningful distinction. There's one view that everybody has problems with self-control, that what we call addiction is really a universal issue, that the phenomenon of people keeping on using despite the urge to stop and despite the intention to stop could just as easily be applied not only to things like frantic activity and seeking external validation, or perhaps eating, but even anxiety disorders where worry becomes a sort of intentional activity. And there are some people in a more mindfulness-oriented framework that are portraying it that way, and I think with really good effect, that there's an intentional or volitional character to a lot of mental suffering. So what is the difference between that and substance use problems? And at the same time, I'm a person in recovery from addiction, and I consider that to be sort of membership in a particular type of group. There's something special about it. There's something that is extraordinary about the lengths to which some of us go to hide and protect our use patterns. So it's almost paradoxical from the outset that it's sort of a spectrum condition, but then also there's this really deep identification at one end of the spectrum. So I tend to think of it almost more metaphorically than I do as a really clean cut sort of objective scientific classification.
Yeah, and there's definitely the bit in the book where you talk about essentially the power of self-deception, where you're talking about your own process of realizing there was an issue around alcohol, but this idea, like you say, when you start talking about addiction, it opens up all this stuff, and one of them is that sort of insight we all have to the ability to sort of deceive ourselves and how good we are at it, and what was the thing? Was it about like evolutionary? It may well have been useful because it's about sort of, I guess, worst case, it's about deceiving others, but at best case, it's about learning how to sort of convince others so that you sort of work together or something like that.
Yeah, that's the Trivers do. So Robert Trivers is a noted evolutionary psychologist who says that we developed denial and self-deception because it was a way of better deceiving others. That when you yourself are convincing yourself, of the thing, then it's easier to seemingly authentically portray the thing to someone else. And that really resonated with me because the background is I had an episode where I was really struggling with alcohol and stimulants during my psychiatry residency training after med school. And then my program director and a few other people met with me in an intervention. And I basically told them, oh, no. I'm sure you think it's a substance problem, but it really isn't. I just want to let you know that I'm just kind of burnt out and, medicine is broken and I'm getting crushed under the gears of this like free for all for-profit system. And all that was kind of true, but it was also a lie that I was having substance problems. But the thing that struck me about that evolutionary psychology portrayal is that I really identified with that. I really think there was at least a big part of me that believed in that moment that I was telling the truth, that the thing that was most significant was the bullshit I was shoveling, and not so much the fact that I was having half a dozen drinks every night minimum, and then taking Adderall in the morning to recover from it, and just barely getting by in training.
Right. And it's sort of, I guess, the dark side of talking. Because there's, this is one of the things we talked about a lot in the podcast, which is that a lot of, say, politics, for example, or politicians, everyone's ultimately sort of sick of politicians talking. They want to see action. And the thing about the sort of self-deception thing is, or, deceiving others, is that is the power of words, or at least a sort of one of the powers of words is that you can just spin tales and then do something entirely different. And then the podcast sort of sits in that sort of weird place because obviously when talking about sort of mental health issues and or sort of politics related to it, that it's the cardinal sin of it's just more talking and what's action. And I think that what's intriguing, particularly towards the end of the book, is where you're talking about, what actually has to change in terms of law, in terms of the medical establishment for there to be a much more useful way of addressing addiction and recovery. And the thing about it that, the sort of positive spin on all of it really to me was the thing that seemed to happen throughout time was the sort of power of mutual aid, or the power of groups of people. And like you said about sort of identifying with a group of people, or like concepts of identity, and they're all wrapped up in the group, or how you get on with a group of people, or how you identify. And I thought that's kind of interesting in general. I'm sort of just going down a rabbit hole here. I'm not sure if I even got a question at the end of it, just more saying things just in case it's eliciting any sort of thoughts on the subject.
No, it's definitely interesting. I guess I'm wondering, let me ask you, because I'm curious about your perspective, because you were just talking about the cardinal sin of talking rather than doing. What was your, I'll sum it up by saying my takeaway at the end of the book was that, yes, there are these concrete, practical interventions and policies that we could enact tomorrow if we could wave a magic wand to do it. And that would save countless lives when we're talking about addiction. And also, it won't come from some technocratic fix within our current system. What we really need is a change of consciousness around addiction, but also about the way we think about mental health and relating to our suffering. So I guess I was wondering like what your reaction was to that when you talk about the cardinal sin of talking, because it makes me think, I almost feel a little defensive, like, well, I do think that talking is the thing we need to do.
No, but I think it has both things. It's like, it's not, I think it's one of those things where, as you were saying, that it has the power to do both good and bad, if that's not too clumsy a way of breaking everything down, right? Which is that on one hand, there is this power of self-deception, and you can do that through talking. But clearly what works for a lot of people is, well, possibly everyone, is connections with other people. And a lot of the time, the connections with other people is talking about you're experiencing experiences, listening to their experiences. So it's not necessarily that I think talking is it's bad. Like, I think it's a key part of the ingredients of any sort of sense of fellow feeling or connection with the world. It's just also one of those things about putting things into action, right? Like that seems to be the rub of addiction to some degree as well, right? Is that you have that, you can spin whatever story you like to maintain the actions and sort of that there's a real push and pull, that sort of really scary tension that you communicate through your sort of own story, but also just looking at addiction, this and listening to patients, this idea of like this complete, obviously it's a certain kind of addiction. There's lots of people who don't say that they have a problem. They don't have any issue with what they're doing. They don't mind it. Whereas there's the sort of the more terrifying version is the person who wants to stop but can't. And they're just watching themselves be a witness to the thing that they're doing. And this is where that sort of tension of action and dialogue sort of meets.
Yeah. That is, the thing that comes to mind about talking is that's the primary intervention that we have in mental health. We also have medications, of course, and there are group based treatments that try to harness this power of interconnectedness and connecting with other people. But really what we do is we talk, and we have a specialized way of talking, and we train and even conduct research on what is the kind of psychotherapy that actually leads to change. And I read that stuff and I study that stuff, and I think it's valuable. But what is the difference between that and mutual help? Throughout history, we've oscillated between these different responses to addiction. Sometimes the formal medical interventions like talk therapy have been privileged. Sometimes medications have been privileged. Sometimes you could almost call them populist mutual help, grassroots, informal movements have dominated. I think addiction is a funny test case for a lot of mental health treatment because it has so many different stakeholders, and it's so politicized, and it's so in many ways responsive to social and cultural factors like despair and alienation and dislocation. And one of the lessons I really like about the responses to addiction, especially viewed through a historical lens, is that we need it all. That it's not all talking, and it's not all formal medical responses, and it's not all some sort of policy tweak from the top down, like adjusting alcohol taxes. Like, we need all of those things to effectively respond to the challenge. Right now we're faced with tremendous, I'm sure your listeners are familiar because this is a mental health oriented podcast, but we hit a milestone of 100,000 overdose deaths a year in the United States. It's astounding. It's unthinkable. I wrote a paper in 2019 where I said we've just reached the milestone of 72,000 deaths. That was 3 years ago. Just the pace of it is so completely out of control. There's almost like this funny disjunction between like the available policy levers that were even given and the actual scope of the problem. It's just really daunting. So like it's really maddening to me that people are not running out there and just doing everything possible. Anyway, but I'm getting a little away from your original question, so I'll stop there.
No, it's all good. Sorry, Ikoi.
Oh no, I was just about to say, I come to, my line of work from a very, I guess, I've been told an unusual angle because I started at the harm reduction aspect. So that wasn't something that, I changed to eventually. And I guess especially, for somebody my age, I'm in my 40s, people are like, oh, that's really unusual. And also, because I came to drug policy has always been, interesting to me, because my first interest, one of my earliest interests as a child, has been like disease and public health. So when AIDS came around in the 80s, I was still in elementary school, but that's the one thing about having access to college libraries and college librarians, especially back then, was I had an outlet for that interest. And so I basically became interested through researching AIDS and HIV. That was probably the first time I heard about, needle exchange. And I had always been interested in medical, topics. So, I knew about, I had heard about, IV drug use. But, at that age, I knew enough about, blood-borne infections that made all the sense to me. And also growing up, I grew up with a very visibly dysfunctional, uncle who, basically, from the moment he got up to, when he went to sleep was, drinking and inebriated on a daily basis. And watching him and watching other people drink and not have an issue, from an early age, I was like, it can't be the alcohol. It has to be something else. And so I basically kind of, and then as I grew older, and especially around, I've always been kind of a risk averse personality. So a lot of it was just watching, my friends and their experience with drugs. And going okay, it definitely isn't just the substance. There's something else happening. And I, and looking from coming out and growing up, I think during the AIDS epidemic where, and it was also the Just Say No era. And I remember just being okay, this Just Say No thing clearly isn't working. It's not working with any of my friends. It's not necessarily working with society. And, and that was also kind of with the AIDS panic came this really strong push for abstinence only education in sexual health. Right. And I just remember thinking no, that doesn't work. You need to give people information so that they can, better adjust their behavior based on their risk, rather than kind of building more intrinsic shame in people around, whether it's sexuality or whether it's drug use. So that's kind of my background in how I came to be interested in the topic, because, I don't personally have a substance use disorder history. But it's also one of those things where, growing up around a lot of friends that did, I could see in my own, I guess one aspect is that I don't necessarily, I tend to kind of lean towards more that compulsive behaviors or chaotic behaviors are part of human psychology.
To my mind, it's one of the very relatable parts of the book. Even at the beginning or the conclusion is this idea of that essentially everything is on a spectrum. All behaviors are on a spectrum. A person who is voluntary or not takes the label of being an addict is ultimately just the same as everyone else. It's just for XYZ reason, multiple reasons, it's being expressed, in a particular way, and that any of us at any point in our lives could face any of this stuff. And if and when such a thing happens, how do we conceptualize it, or how do we deal with it? And to my mind, your approach makes total sense, which is like there isn't just this one way of thinking about all of this. There are multiple ways of thinking about it, and there are multiple ways of recovering from it. And it's, I think, I can't remember if this was in one of your podcasts or it was at the beginning of the book, but you were just saying addiction ultimately is an idea. And there's a sort of opening statement. I was like, wow, okay, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, thanks for picking up on that. That is, it's early in the book. It's a major theme of the book, along with this notion that addiction exists in all of us. And I think those two topics, the 1980s and all of those abstinence-oriented campaigns around sex or drugs or otherwise, there's a way that's related to this notion that addiction exists in all of us. I really emphasize that because it's been such a common tendency to turn it into an us-them binary, as if there's some sort of bright essential line dividing up the supposedly healthy from addiction. And I was surprised to find that that's a relatively recent historical phenomenon, that earlier thinkers, even as recent as 19th century medical writers, who I think had a better sense of this than we give them credit, but all the way back to philosophers and theologians who look at the problem of will and self-control through a different lens, conceptualize it more as like that core volitional question we were talking about earlier, the why do people keep on using despite the urge to stop. But the way that relates to the 80s in particular, just the general notion of the ideologically driven, like abstinence oriented approaches is it's almost a natural corollary to the notion of dividing up into healthy and addicted, to also divide up drugs into good drugs and bad drugs, and that certain types of drugs are associated with the wrong sort of users, and then that lends itself to a sort of polarized binary around it. Yeah, it enables the use of both the notion of addiction and just drug use in general as a weapon in various forms, which is definitely what was happening in the 1980s. I mean, it's well documented by now just how the tail was wagging the dog when it came to drug problems. It was the Reagan administration, before there was any sort of significant outcry or concern, latched on to drugs, and crack actually came a bit later. At first, it was that some political opportunism, because there were these largely Southern parents groups that were really concerned about cannabis, and they thought that Jimmy Carter and also Ford, and also even to an extent the people in the Nixon administration, were too easy on that. It was when I talked to experts about that time period, because some of those folks are still alive. When I talked to policy experts who served in, say, for example, the Carter administration and earlier, it was amazing the way they described the transition then. It was almost as if they stepped out onto a different planet. Because like from Ford to Carter in the 1970s, people played nicer with each other in terms of drug policy. It was much more, and there are problems with this too. I mean, there's a sort of like technocratism about like trying to find the right top-down way to control people's use. But I mean, it was better than the Reagan administration,
right?
They were working practically on like, okay, well, what is the real harm of cannabis, and do we really need to be so tough on it? Blah blah blah. And then it was all of a sudden, bang! Clear the decks. All the experts fired, brand new people come in, and it was a real inflection point in the so-called war on drugs. I mean, it's just like I grew up in that time too. So I think it's like really vivid to think about like the 80s and the 90s and just how extreme some of that messaging was.
Yeah, it was, I mean, that was a big start, I think, in understanding how, because one of the things that I do really appreciate about your book, and part of why, I was like, oh, we should totally interview this author, is I feel like it's vital that people understand, kind of like the historical trajectory of drugs and how that's never been this cohesive thing. that attitudes have changed, policies have changed over time, and how that's impacted what essentially are people in need of some kind of assistance, oftentimes.
Yeah.
And how that's how like criminal, well, like the historical aspect of, because I think it's really there is a huge political expedience aspect to issues around sex and disease and drugs and what we call vices, right?
Yeah. Oh, the vice stuff is so interesting. And how deep that is in American culture in particular.
Yes.
But also more generally, I mean, like the way people talked openly about vice and the relationship to vice, especially in the so-called progressive era, post-Civil War, 1880s, 1890s, and then the way all of those things shifted in the early 20th century. There's so many ways we could go with that, but I just like the way things were labeled as a vice, and the way in many cases powerful corporate interests played an active role in shaping what we thought was a vice and what we didn't think was a vice, where we located the problem when we had different sort of complex social issues.
Right.
I think we lose sight of that. We lose sight of how what we consider to be a vice is not, just like what you were saying before, Liam, like it's an idea. It's not some sort of essential fact. It's not a natural kind that exists through the ages and is just bequeathed unto us.
Right. It's not like some kind of natural law, like gravity, right?
Correct me if I'm sort of misremembering this, but the bit that sort of maybe sounds obvious was the part where you were saying that actually the substances that have done the most harm are the ones that are sort of above the line, above board. They're the legal ones, and or tobacco, alcohol, and or they're under the category of medical. And that is sort of fascinating, right? Because the concentration, the focus, sort of politically at least, is always on again, it's always sort of the individual who is either to blame for their, historically, I guess speaking, sort of their poor moral worth, or it's like, or no, it's not that, it's the individual is diseased. It's fascinating that, again, this sort of over a period of time, attitudes have changed, and where the sort of finger of blame is being pointed is changing. Now, I guess the question that bothers me is it progressing all in the right direction? Is there such now a body of evidence about things that can ultimately overpower sort of political stories? You're talking about America in the 80s. Is there sort of enough evidence that something like that couldn't happen again? The scientific community could sort of like point at all these studies and go, okay, no, we're not going back in that direction. Or are sort of politics and these sort of meme or mimetic stories that take hold of a population stronger than that?
I think anything's possible, Liam. Not to think glib about it. These things tend to move in cycles, and I found remarkable similarities. It's not like anti-drug racism or anti-drug prohibitionism was born in the 1980s. It wasn't born with Richard Nixon. It wasn't born in the 1920s when opioids and cocaine were first essentially outlawed, or at least tightly regulated. They're outlawed for the wrong sorts of people, essentially. These things tend to move in cycles because drug use and addiction are some of the most complex social problems we have. Even as I say this, I want to just say, not all drug use is problematic. So let's be clear that I'm not saying that. But problematic substance use and addiction, which are not the same thing, are some of the most complex social problems we have. And so there tends to be this almost like, if you can imagine a chaotic pendulum, if you remember that. I just took my son to a science museum. So I'm thinking of how, like, if there are multiple centers of gravity, the pendulum kind of like spins around in this like really wonky and difficult to predict way. Like it's not like it's a polarized. It's not like there are two poles. It's there are all these different stakeholders I sort of glancingly mentioned before. There's like the prohibitionist drive, but then there's also this sort of clinical drive, and then there's this related but separate reductionistic drive, and then there's always been mutual help groups going back way before 12-step groups in AA. And so they, I think that, and one of the points of the book is that things go best when everyone finds points of connection and humble synthesis and recognizes that it's a complex multi-level problem that needs to be addressed across all those different levels. But more often than not, because of everyday human greed and hatred and ignorance, we wind up swinging between sort of extreme and oversimplified views of drug use and of addiction. I do think, Liam, that we're at a promising moment, coming out of such a starkly prohibitionist moment in American history in particular, and with a lot of people coming forward and sharing their experiences of mental health struggles and people talking in a more nuanced way about drugs, that there is an opportunity for more connection and synthesis now. That is hopeful to me. If we play out the tape 100 years from now, 200 years from now, I don't know. I think these things tend to run in cycles. The best thing we can do is advocate for that kind of more humble and multifaceted perspective as best we can with what we're given.
Yeah, I think it was reading about AA and sort of the initial ideas or their sort of concept of it, and that they were sort of flirting with spirituality, but not necessarily any fixed religion. And then how some of those ideas got changed to some degree by politics. It was, it was just a bit distressing to read because I guess that's sort of where my question was coming from. And in previous conversations we've had, Ikoi, you've expressed some sort of issues with AA, and I think it fits completely in with this this perspective on all of it, because it's like, yeah, AA is great, but it's not great for like everyone. I don't know if you wanted to speak about that a bit more, Ikoi.
Well, I guess also, one of the things I as a counselor, I have to be very, very clear to not dissuade anybody from their chosen, comfort in how they find community. I do have a certain personal, I guess, bias against 12 steps. I mean, not necessarily in that it's just, one of the major issues is that I do see a lot of people abused by sponsors, and that system kind of being very, very unaccountable. And also some of like the more common talking points that, about like, for example, I at this point, I've lost count of how many people, when they talk about like their sexual abuse, being asked like, what was your role? These kinds of framing that I do think is like really harmful. That can be very common in those circles. But, again, like I said, it is helpful for some people. Some people find, great connections, lifelong connections of support. So, I think it's just that, as with any kind of pure support group, regardless of ideology, it's whether you find people that you can connect with, and that's not a shared experience is not necessarily a guarantee of a good connection.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's really important to be clear about the potential dangers. of mutual help groups like AA. They're completely and totally unregulated, of course. They're totally anarchic. If you go to one group, then you've gone to one group. And
right, they're very different between.
But even in New York, there are some that are, very rigid and very Christian and very traditionalist. And then there are some where they've rewritten the book to be more sensitive to gender issues and pronouns, and they make sure that they never call God he, and it's totally different. So, and
in that way, it's good, right? Like
it can be good if you land in the right place and you get the right kind of support to find the thing that works for you. If it is mutual help, I do that. It's shocking to me that it wasn't until I really wrote the book that I recognized all the different varieties of recovery. And I think this is only now percolating out. And part of that is because of this sort of unholy alliance between certain elements of 12-step advocacy and the treatment industry through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that's a place where people get it twisted. There's the treatment industry, which is largely has been allied with 12-step teachings and populated by people who are really committed to a certain type of 12-step practice, and that's presented as the only way. I mean, I have quotes in there from people, again, back in the 80s, in the abstinence-focused 80s.
I mean, it's still a dominant force in treatment. It's somebody that has, a very strong harm reduction leaning. It's sometimes very difficult to be in that space.
Yeah, totally. But, I think it's only now that certain treatment providers and treatment centers like rehabs are starting to bring in mutual help groups that are not AA.
And there's not very many of them. I mean,
there's not very many. Hopefully there's more of it, because, I see in the writings and like, if you look at like, say, Counselor magazine, there's more of this appreciation for the many paths of recovery. I think that's so important. But a lot of that harshness and like ideological rigidity, I think, came more from the alcohol and drug addiction treatment industry, and not from AA. And then it gets attributed to AA. In other words,
it's kind of like a cycle. It's a feedback cycle, I think, in a lot of ways. Because like at my facility, I was one of the only, I think I was the only counselor that didn't have, a 12-step background. I mean, I was also, one of only 2 counselors that didn't have a personal history.
Right.
But out of the 2 of us, the other person was really, really familiar, had gone with family, etc.
Right.
So
I think that makes sense. That like there's a feedback mechanism where the predominant social and cultural mores locally or globally come back to influence the groups and the way that things are practiced. One example of that is the disease idea. A lot of people attribute the disease idea of addiction to AA or to 12-step groups in general. And I think that's not true. If you look at the historical record, actually, the early founders were very careful about using medical metaphors. And it's almost like the notion of disease came about as a result of advocacy that wasn't quite AA, but it was done by people who were in AA. And then there was this sort of like weird communication with them. And then,
I think it was a clumsy attempt to destigmatize.
Yeah. I don't know how well it worked. Yeah, I agree that it's clumsy because like if they didn't use the notion of disease, maybe all that energy would have achieved the same outcome, because that advocacy did force open the doors of hospitals. Like a lot of what we're talking about is sort of like the downstream consequences of the medical profession totally abandoning the care of treatment with addiction earlier in the century. So like there was a lot that needed to be corrected. Like hospitals weren't treating people, and there was no funding for any sort of like recovery support or care. And it was very, very stigmatized. But like, do you actually need disease to say that? I mean, my experience is that I written in the process of talking to people about this book. I've written about disease. This was one of my first things was an essay in the New York Times, and I got all these angry comments from people who thought I was taking shots at AA, because they just associated the notion of disease with AA, and they said, I'm in recovery 20 years, and you must not understand what's going on, and how dare you insult my recovery? And that's not at all my intention. And it's a really complicated interrelationship there between that kind of advocacy and what is assumed to be like an AA idea, that I think ultimately takes a lot more space to unpack than maybe a 800-word guest essay.
Right. I mean, Bill W. was an advocate of psychedelics,
big time, and B12 and intensive psychotherapy, or maybe it was B6. I forget. He got really into one B vitamin. He just thought that there was one particular B vitamin that if you megadosed it, it would cure alcoholism.
Is it the one that causes the suddenly I'm having a blank moment, but there's the one B vitamin that drinking really depletes.
Yeah, no, niacin is usually depleted, and so
did he?
I don't know which one he specifically got hung up on, because it was only like a brief way station on his way to psychedelics.
Yeah, but I think, as with anything, right? What the original intent isn't necessarily, it's an evolving ecosystem. So I mean, I've read a lot on Bill W. and the history of AA, because I do believe that if I'm going to be critical of something, that I really need to be read up on it, right? And again, I think one of the things that I can say positive about 12 Steps is that for its time, it was absolutely revolutionary.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's just that it didn't necessarily evolve in the long run as a community.
Yeah, I don't know about that, honestly. I would push back a little on that, because I think that there is evolution in different domains. And if you look at the research, it is very difficult research to do, as I'm sure you have looked into and have read about, that the people like John Kelly and Keith Humphreys, and the big researchers who try to do objective analyses of what actually happens when you connect people with AA, is that, I think they would acknowledge there are these problems. There's exploitation, sexual and otherwise, by sponsors. And there's some groups that are really sort of gaslighting in the way they focus too much on personal responsibility. And there are groups that are really, I think maybe even a greater form of, we don't have to rank it. Yet another serious form of harm is anti-medication stigma, which is really fatal during an overdose epidemic. But even acknowledging all those problems, on balance, when you study the effect of referring people to AA, it does more good than harm. So I'm fully in favor of criticizing some of the current shortcomings in the way it's both institutionalized in our treatment system, as well as just what it's like on the ground. And I think people probably benefit from getting introduced to it. And so I recommend to most of my patients, check out a few meetings if it works for you.
Well, I think my main issue with it is that, it became such a dominant force in treatment.
Yes,
and that it wasn't just, if it stayed in the scope of practice of mutual help, I think it would have been a lot more beneficial.
Yes.
Then
I completely and totally agree with that.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's so, it has crowded out other options and even created sort of an ideological overcommitment to one model. So not only is it one size fits all, but we've had these controversies ever since the 1970s where any sort of alternative pathways get shouted down, and there's huge conflicts and warring press conferences and character assassination. I described the story of researchers in the 70s who try to talk about some of the different approaches. For some people, and we have to be very careful about this, but for some people, moderation works even after severe substance use problems. But some really powerful forces in advocacy and even government tried to suppress that research, and then when it didn't work, called the people killers and amoral, because it didn't fit with their preferred paradigm. And I think we need everything we can get. We need all the potential pathways, and sensibly and wisely to engage people with those pathways and to see what works for them. To say there's a big difference between saying this is beneficial to a lot of people and saying this is the only way. And it often is this. It's my own confidence in this pathway is so fragile that I have to blindly insist that it's the only possible way that people can recover from a substance use problem. I think that's really dangerous and really tragic in a way.
And I think it goes against like basic human psychology, I guess, is kind of what was frustrating my entire life, looking at, drugs and how drug policy and how it impacted, my friends of, many who didn't make it.
Well, I mean, thank you for sharing about those experiences. I'm sorry to hear about that. I had, growing up in North Jersey in the 80s and 90s, I had the same experience of people dying from overdoses and not even like fully comprehending the scope of it until later in life.
Yeah, I mean, one of the probably, especially with, because the first experience that I had with like, or exposure to like heroin within my peers and like seeing it like around people using it was, in the 90s. And that was when a lot of these happened, but like one of the things about like policy, for example, like naltrexone is an old drug. People think Narcan is some new, brand new, invention that just happened recently. No, it's a really old drug. And I think a lot of how we look at addiction and how we look at drug use and how we look at stigma, if Narcan had been deployed in, because it existed in the 90s, and had we had the wherewithal to utilize what we already had back then, how many lives would we have saved? And how many lives we still continue to not save?
Yeah, oh my goodness, so many left on the table. So many simple things that we could do to reduce death. I want to take the opportunity to plug my colleague's book, Maya Svalovitz. I don't know if you talked about her.
Oh yeah, I've read her books though. She's she's very informative.
She's written a great history of harm reduction where she talks about some of those early barriers, and incidentally, how some of the early harm reduction pioneers were people in 12-step recovery.
Oh, absolutely.
They were people who were not like caught up in the ideological rigidity. At the same time, some people at the Betty Ford Center were saying, if you don't go to AA, you'll never make it. Other people were like in recovery themselves, but then recognized in 12-step based recovery themselves, but then recognized it's better to save a life than otherwise, and maybe we can meet flexibly where they are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I also have a Buddhist background, and so that was, and listening to because you feature Buddhism in your podcast, so I picked up on a couple of those episodes to listen, but I think that was also maybe the difference in my baseline approach of not growing up in a Christian moralist kind of philosophy from an early age. Like, one of the biggest takeaways of Buddhism is like, this concept of like not being attached to things, not be trying to, have a deeper understanding, because a lot of times there's a lot of colloquial misunderstandings about like the concept of, the Buddhist concept of like life is suffering, or, this concept of attachment, because people are like, oh, attachment's good, and it's not, it's not saying that attachment is bad. It's just understanding what attachment is and the role that it plays in your life.
But, in some ways, this sort of goes back to the earlier point of that addiction's an idea, just all the ideas and concepts that people have in their heads can haunt you. Like there's a bit in your book where you're talking about a client who's saying sort of quite defeated that, they're questioning whether their alcoholism is genetic, right?
Mm.
And really that, it's a science, but for that person, it's a concept. And that's a sort of haunting idea, right? It's like, I'm not, you could replace it with other words, it's like my destiny,
Mm-hmm.
It's like I am powerless against this thing. And I think that sort of training we get through osmosis in our culture does have a sort of profound effect on how we sort of act and react in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it becomes a shorthand for a seemingly objective scientific label can become shorthand for something that is really a social judgment or a values-based judgment. And that's happened over and over again. But genetics was also, by the way, really, we were talking a lot about the 70s and 80s. I guess that makes sense. But if we're interested in capitalism, but the genetic narrative was a really powerful one in the 80s. Some of that was just the fact that that's when the science evolved. But, I think there's something about that sort of notion of brokenness or fatalism that can be attached to a genetic narrative that really took hold. And by the way, was also really effectively used by growing and highly profitable treatment centers to market their treatments, to say that, because it's genetic, you definitely have this thing and we have the answer and you can't fix it by yourself. But, I've seen people who use the notion of genetics as just one of many factors, like, I'm a little more at risk of this, and so I need to be careful. And I think that's a reasonable and relatively healthy approach, because there is a genetic contribution to risk for substance use disorders. But I've also had lots and lots of patients who, Liam, this is the example you're probably thinking of, who basically use the word genetic to mean I can't do otherwise. A client who called me and said they're in the middle of a relapse and trying to engage their motivation. And they say, well, I'm going to drink again. I don't think I'm going to stop because it's genetic, right? That means I have it. That means I can't change it. And so genetic becomes conflated with a sort of fatalism that has, it's always found some scientific story to attach itself to, like during eugenics, it was a different story about fatalism, but it was basically the same core story. And then there are even earlier analogs in the history of science and society. But really is a fundamentally philosophical argument about capacity to choose and capacity to do otherwise.
Yeah. Well, the disease model also has the same kind of impact, because I've had clients be like, well, if this is permanent and chronic disease,
and that's what the evidence says. I mean, when I think the disease label, I don't even use the disease model phrasing because I don't know what a disease model is. I think there's, hundreds of models and people think they're referring to one thing and it's actually a lot of different things, because it's a double-edged sword, because you can use the word disease in these really beneficial ways. You can use it to argue to open the doors of hospitals. You can use it to argue for funding or just a baseline level of compassion and treating people like human beings. And then you can also use the word disease to be dehumanizing and fatalistic, or even to outright use it as a weapon to say, because these people have a disease, that means we have to commit them involuntarily.
Quarantine them, right?
Quarantine them. Literally put them in colonies in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, when people, again, during the time of vice advocacy and activism around the progressive era, people said, okay, well, we can't effectively treat addiction, so let's just ship people off to colonies. And that's totally misleading. We have great evidence today that people recover at much higher rates than we commonly attribute it. That in some ways, by some measures, people with substance use problems have a higher probability of recovery than other forms of mental suffering. It just this brokenness narrative is so powerful and insidious that it creeps into this sort of like deterministic story.
Right.
And that was also sort of blew my socks off as well, reading that most people who have some kind of is it disordered choice? Well, that was a particular way of phrasing it, but maybe I'm mixing my language here. But it's just that idea that a lot of people who have alcohol issues or other issues just find a way to figure it out themselves. I don't know how's that information collected. I guess that's a side thing, but that's sort of fascinating as well. That there's just a whole bunch of people who are not partaking in, any sort of formalized or informal therapy. They're just finding another way, probably through other structures, right? Family, job, friends.
Right, which are, pathways to recovery, basically. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of stats on this, but the bottom line is that most people with substance problems will recover, and most people who, if you use the definition of recovery, that's just stable improvements in functioning and purpose in life, most people will recover, and most of those don't need any sort of medical help to do so. So
the Vietnam thing was fascinating about the was it 20% or 10% of troops had a heroin problem during the war, and when they came back, that number dropped dramatically.
Right. I mean, there's a huge environmental factor, and that's also one area that treatment really likes to somewhat ignore in terms of not necessarily just a treatment industry, but in terms of drug policy, because for me, like my experience was working with a lot of housing insecure and homeless people. And, a lot of times it really is difficult for people who haven't, had work history or, education that makes acquiring well-paying jobs fairly, accessible. It really is hard for them to, go through treatment, and to a certain degree, like treatment makes them feel like sobriety is something that if they fail, it's their fault, right? But they go out of treatment and they can't find work, they can't find affordable housing.
Yeah, what was the term? Recovery capital. Is that was used in the book?
Yeah, it is incredible that people use that term, but yeah,
and there's so little services out for people. And I mean, there's so much gaps in service out for people that, a lot of times, if you are having basic survival issues, a lot of times we kind of ignore that these people are having these issues. And then, when they don't succeed, once they leave treatment, the attitude is like, oh, it's your fault. You didn't take the program seriously. When it's like, no, they can't find housing because they can't find a job.
Right. And then, we have public health interventions that address those types of issues, that address the issue of, say, housing or work. And the other countries have generally done a better job. The famous example of Portugal with decriminalization of amounts of any drug for personal use sometimes gets trotted out as an example of why we should decriminalize. And just leaving that question entirely aside, what often gets missed is that Portugal had really, really, really intense interventions for housing and for employment. People who entered into treatment got, moved to the front of the line, and it's so crucial. And that is health. One of the phrases I really like is health in all. It goes a little farther than, say, social determinants of health, for example, which sounds a little jargony.
Dry.
Yeah. That health is everywhere. Health is about the tree cover in your neighborhood. Health is about your access to basic human needs.
Yeah, we're going to have to wrap it up, I guess, just because we've hit the hour. Ultimately, I thought there was sort of an answer, like whilst reading the book, and the common theme throughout all these sort of difficult moments in time was just that people do find a way, and normally they find a way with other people. And I think that, the key point in the book is just that, this is a big complex system, and it's going to take lots of different solutions and lots of different methods to get there. But anyway, yeah, sorry, I realised we've taken a whole bunch of your time up there, extra time. So apologies for that, Carl. But thank you very much.
No need to apologize. It was a pleasure meeting you two.
Yeah.
Thanks for the work you do.
Thank you so much.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.